You're listening to the I Love You Keep Going podcast with George Haas. For more information, please visit our website at www.mettagroup.org. That's www.mettagroup.org.
So welcome, everybody. This is I Love You Keep Going. It is September 5th, 2024 at 7:35 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. And I thought that I would continue talking about exploration and what happens when you don't learn to do it in childhood, or when something interferes with the arising of the creative self, which is the way that it's described often in Western psychoanalytic terms. In attachment terms, we would say that the attachment system turns off and the exploration system turns on. And in, I think, a Buddhist frame, it would be that you come out of the limited identification with the self and you operate from the place of not self. So shifting out of that very tight, limited identity of what's possible and what isn't possible, and opening up into the capacity of the whole body mind to discover things that are meaningful. In some sense, it's just shifting into that place of freedom and allowing the body mind to then engage in activities that it finds rewarding. And then noticing when that sense of self arises that's constricting, noticing when the exploration system shuts down and the attachment system turns back on. There's that piece of emotional dysregulation interfering with the capacity to explore, and then understanding how to bring yourself back into emotional balance so that it can shut down again and the exploration system can turn back on. Another way to talk about it really is advanced mentalizing and moving out of the basic frame of mentalizing into the pursuit of yes, there are higher forms of expression. Anytime I'm confronted with the hierarchy, I'm always concerned about the point of view that you're looking at something from. Hierarchies or descriptions of this. And without going into a lot of detail about the nature of the higher levels of mentalizing, just in this talk, that basic frame of being able to let the mind be spontaneous at the same time monitoring it, being able to discern clearly yourself as distinct from others, the internal expression, the external world, thinking and feeling. When you come out of that sense of identity, in some ways, you're also coming out of the confines of the culture. What is that? Those cultural limits that are imposed. What has value in that regard? What happens if the things that really matter to you, the things that move you, that you want to pursue, don't have cultural value? It's in some sense easy enough to set that aside, but what also is triggered by things that have high cultural value are the resources that flow into making them possible. So if you pursue things that don't have a high cultural value that are likely to return that value to you, then you're in a position of balancing the primary exploration with the secondary exploration, because you have to provide time, energy, and resources to be able to explore that. If you flow your time, energy, resources into things that aren't culturally valuable, that what you'll find over a period of time is that you don't have the markers of cultural value that might be socially rewarded. And then what do you do? You abandon the things that really matter to you in order to track the cultural pieces, or can you abandon those and live a life where really it's focused on the meaning part, and the collection of the cultural milestones is not so important. What I find in that process, of course, is that there's so much in the way of media and representation of the cultural values that even though you most of the time find that you have this a sense of reward from pursuing the things that matter, a sense of doubt can arise when you don't actually collect all of the totems. And the other thing that happens, of course, depending on what it is, what avenue you are, is that you get into rarer and rare places of understanding, thinking. And then how do you relate to people that aren't actually in your line of exploration? Once you've figured out how to turn that exploratory self, that creative self on, then you can begin looking. We were talking about this last time in relationship to attachment conditioning and how that affects this. Really, the group that is the most challenged in terms of exploration are people with some kind of preoccupation, mainly because the way that preoccupation forms is through an interference with the capacity to explore. You know, when you're small, just crawling around, you're needing constant reassurance, constant emotional regulation to pursue regulation. You need to have the caregivers monitor the risks that you might take and allow you to stretch out to the within the limit of your capacity and not over it. Be protected and safe. And then you also need somebody who's interested in what it is that you're discovering. So that cycle is to go out and explore and then to return and express the things that you've discovered. When you're inhibited from that, then those inhibitions need to be removed before you can really get into the exploration. If we would talk about this from a place of emotional regulation, we all basically start out as autoregulators. And one of the traps that dismissing adults get into is thinking that their exploration is exploration when actually it's largely auto-regulating. They're just distracting themselves or engaging themselves as a way of emotionally regulating and not really pursuing the activation of the creative self and what might be meaningful. When somebody comes well enough that you move from auto-regulation to external regulation, but not well enough that you move into a collaborative relationship experience, you remain dependent on the emotional regulation of someone else to bring you enough into balance that the attachment system shuts down and the exploration system turns on. And if you don't have that regulation, then the exploration system stays off and you don't really have the capacity to explore. And disorganized people are fearful of the world, and that fearfulness keeps the attachment system engaged and doesn't permit the exploration system to arise. So can you track all of that and see how that's operating within you based on your conditioning so that you can begin to move out of it into that place where the sense of the exploratory self, the creative self arises freely when you need it. That's really what we mean by advanced mentalizing, that you can tell the difference between an active exploration system and an active attachment system, that you can identify the sense of self when it's arisen and is constricting, and that you have a way of coming out of that into this spacious, open, unrestricted mind that then allows you to pursue what's meaningful to you, which you discover by the body-mind exploring. Who did?
Oh, I this is the first time probably I've actually realized, or the distinction so clearly, that the sense of self is almost a blocker.
Yeah.
That you were supposed to explore from the no self or emptiness of self point of view, that which I realized you can say that it's like oh, now I understand why we say that the sense of self coming from the openness, not the openness itself, but yeah, okay, I see. Because I was always confused, because I was always looking for my sense of self's exploration, but it's actually the openness's exploration, not my own small selves. Does that sound right?
That's right. So how do you come and go from that self-experience? And in some sense, we could say that's a kind of liberation, that ability to come and go and not be trapped.
But how will people do this without like advanced meditations? The openness is not easily accessible for a person who's simply doing an attachment course.
The way that I discovered this was through meditation.
Same.
But then I also didn't grow up in a secure environment where I was what didn't require a kind of vigilance, and it was quite frightening, the environment I grew up in. So I don't know what that perspective would be, where you simply were encouraged from a young age. Your caregivers paid attention to you, they saw what mattered to you, and they encouraged you to go into it. And they kept good boundaries with you so that you developed a sense of confidence in your ability to do that. I think that if you can come and go from the sense of self, and you understand what's meaningful and you can engage it, you're not going to come here. And in the West, you're probably not going to meditate either. Maybe at least my experience of people who come to meditation is they come because the standard kit doesn't really help them relieve the distress of their life. So they look for something else. And because meditation provides relief so quickly, it engages people. And I teach different kinds of groups of people, and the groups that are traditionally low mentalizing, it is very encouraging that they can explore the mentalizing simply and rapidly, but also to understand that a lot of people operate with very low mentalizing and not no instructions for how to even comprehend that there's such a thing as mentalizing. How can you, which you can, all these things, learn to recognize these things and then shift from one state to another with agency is really, I think, what we're talking about. Simply drop out of the difficulty of the limited identity into that spaciousness. And then everything is available.
And you said the sense of doubt arises when you don't collect what?
Well, what I was saying is when you don't collect the typical markers of a successful person in our society, because you've used your time, energy, and resources in the pursuit of things that mattered to you, but were not of cultural value, then there's a pressure from the social spheres around you that are engaged in that.
Gotcha.
You know, you might get pressure from family or friend groups that what you're pursuing is actually not what's culturally valuable. And so that it's actually you're stumbling rather than pursuing something that would be meaningful.
Extremely high in Asian countries.
Yeah. And so I don't, the reason I bring it up is not so much that it isn't still better to focus on the things that matter, but it's also, I think, an experience that causes the rising of doubt, particularly when you're in a period of exploration that isn't so fruitful, which is also pretty ordinary. When you see the value of really landing on something that provides a lot of meaning to you, all of the false starts that didn't really go anywhere, that you went through in order to discover the thing that you needed to know, doesn't matter so much. You get quite used to the ease of a no in some ways, right? If somebody says no, there's nothing else to do and it's finished. Somebody says yes, of course, then you have to engage all of the stuff that is part of that, which is much more complex. But then how many of those, you go in a direction, you discover what you can, you take what's meaningful, and it directs you often in another direction. You're constantly moving toward that. That's a kind of secure model for that. When you don't have that sense of security, for instance, dismissing people are very sensitive to positions of societal value because they use that position to trade for care. So it can be difficult for them to shift into something that actually would be more meaningful, particularly when they're not remunerated. And preoccupied people really tend to believe that the meaningfulness of life comes from proximity to somebody who's engaged in an exploration that has value. It doesn't come from that, but it's often the belief in that. So there's all that it can be pressure from a preoccupied person on you to share your exploration. That sharing of the exploration is what's important. You go out and discover something and you come back and you express the thing that you've discovered. And in that expression of the thing that you've discovered with somebody who can really see and understand it, there's a sense of intimacy that arises around. a sense of being valued, being seen, being known. And that's that cycle of exploration. When you don't have that piece, which is often a challenge for dismissing people, they hold that primary exploration almost completely privately because of the conditions of the childhood where it wasn't valued in the family system. And to get them to risk the rejection and often shame of expressing what is ultimately important can be quite challenging because the expectation is one of rejection. But when you don't share it, it's easy to have a distorted perspective of it, and also easy for it to become an auto-regulating strategy, which isn't actually producing much beyond a kind of distracted stasis. It doesn't lead to the growth of understanding this human condition. So we start where we are. That's really the idea. When, or I might say, you start with what's left. You have a really hard, difficult childhood. A lot of those capacities are lost. We can't hang around hoping that we can revive them or recover them, recreate them. We really have to examine what's left, pursue with what we have. The shift for dismissing people is out of a sort of siloed pursuit of what comes from secondary exploration, the time, energy, and resources that they use to contract the kind of care they want, into a more collaborative way of being with people, so that you can set up a social network that will be receptive and interested in the primary exploration. The thing about dismissing people is they have all the skills already, and their mentalizing capacity is pretty close to a level that you would need for security. And so it's less of a lift to get into a place where you actually are willing to risk primary exploration and also risk the expression of that to other people. The emotional regulation piece is challenging for dismissing people because the main way that they usually regulate themselves is by suppressing awareness of their emotions. So that needs to be drawn into the conscious experience. And then strategies for regulating it so that you have agency to shift in and out of the limiting self-identity. Dismissing people are over monitoring, which means that they're really confined to that limited identity most of the time, and very resistant to the spontaneity that is required for exploration. So there's a shift out of that tightness, that control, that deactivation into a fully engaged position. Woody?
Sorry, what's the correlation between mentalizing and collaboration in this dismissive use? Isn't the monitoring a good piece? When a dismissive person is monitoring his state, what mentalizing of what?
So when you're talking about not monitoring per se, but over monitoring. So the natural state of dismissing people is over monitoring, and that interferes with the spontaneous movement. As long as you're over monitoring and you're interfering with spontaneity, you don't have the capacity for spontaneous exploration. That would be the quickest path to what's meaningful. And so you need to begin to draw down that super monitoring. That super monitoring also keeps you trapped in a sense of self. The habit of dismissing people is to preview all of the expressions that they might make through the self experience and understand them, how they might land from the self experience, rather than simply risking spontaneity. In a totally spontaneous exchange, because the conscious self experience runs about a half a second behind the activity of the body mind, you would have to feel safe to make an expression and hear it at the same time as the person that you were expressing it. Dismissing people, that makes them extremely uncomfortable because they're so sensitive to rejection and so sensitive to shame. They like to preview it in through the self experience and then express it. So that's why there's a kind of rigidness or a kind of stiltedness in the way that they converse, because everything runs a half a second behind in order to preview it. So there's a notable absence of the spontaneity piece. When you really get going, of course, you're both hearing what you're saying at the same time, which is very lively, right? And because you're shifting out of the self-consciousness of self, it can often be surprising how changeable it is. But of course, you're monitoring, so if the communication doesn't land, you can repair it right away.
Well, in this case, it's just like this graciousness aspect, right?
Say that again.
The over monitoring aspect, I think I also struggle with that. It's just that I really, when I'm doing like see, hear, feel, I have to like almost like imagine that there's nothing behind my head to open up the space.
Yeah. Just letting it go with no interference. That is, in some sense, a description of the state of mind where exploration is possible. Preoccupied people, because, so one last thing about dismissing people, you need to have a group of people that you trust, that you are willing to tell everything to, which is where the collaborative piece comes in. You take care of them, they take care of you. This is very different than the typical relationship with a dismissing person where you take care of them and they don't reciprocate. So you have to be willing to open up and express the things that are of fundamental importance to you. And you have to do it with people that will receive that and cherish it and value it. Preoccupied people, because they're dependent on other people for exploration, the separation to go explore puts them in a state of dysregulation, which activates the self experience, which shuts down the exploration system. So that's the conundrum for them at the beginning of this. They need to learn to develop a capacity to emotionally regulate themselves separate from the people that they use to regulate themselves. If you look at that early development of emotional regulation, we all started out as auto-regulators. And then if somebody comes reliably enough, we shifted to external regulation. And if they show up reliably enough where we can see the patterns of care and see the patterns of emotional regulation, then we begin to interject those skills and we begin to be able to do that for ourselves. And because we're confident in the reliability of our regulators, we can separate from, go explore. But if we get so distressed that we can't manage it ourselves, know that we can come rushing back and that they'll be available to us. That's that collaborative regulation experience. once you learn to develop agency in regulating your own emotions, preoccupied people then also have to begin to learn to explore. And one of the things that secure people have, and also to some degree dismissing people have, is resilience against the predominance of no's or dead ends in exploration. Once you get a real taste of what can happen when you find something that's truly meaningful, that is the beginning of the source of resilience, because you know that all of the dead ends and all of the things that don't really produce much in the way of meaning are inconsequential toward finding something that's meaningful. And the more you pursue exploration, and the more you succeed at finding what's meaningful, the more resilient you become, because you know that it's something that you can do and something that you can find. But for adults that are just beginning their exploration process, it often can feel quite defeating after a couple of dead ends, kind of a sense of hopelessness that you're going to be able to discover anything, that you're going to be able to do it. Helplessness is one of the qualities of preoccupied people, which they tend to learn in childhood, where the caregivers take over their exploration. So they haven't really learned the capacity for those low levels of frustration. You're a child and you're attempting to do something, and your caregiver gets frustrated with you not being able to do it, and then they take it over and do it for you. So one of the things that activates in preoccupied people as they're beginning to learn to explore is the sense of helplessness, that they can't do it, and then the expectation that somebody else will come in and do it for them. Who did?
So would it be true to say that a person who's in a relationship right now, a preoccupied person who is in a relationship right now, would be good to explore, because he or she has the dependent person that he or she can rely on?
It depends, I guess, on the relationship. If you're in a relation, if you're preoccupied and you've picked a dismissing person, they're not going to reciprocate to support your exploration. In fact, they're not going to really be open to you leaving them in order to explore, because then you won't be there to provide care for them. So often what happens is that you pick somebody who continues to interfere with your capacity to explore. One of the dynamics in dismissing and preoccupied relationships is the constant dissatisfaction that the preoccupied person feels because they're not exploring, which they then hector their partner about. But dismissing people can use that energy as an encouragement for their own exploration, particularly when both people are centered around cultural markers of what it is to be successful. The dismissing person then benefits from depriving the preoccupied person of their exploration, because they use the constant hectoring and energy of the preoccupied person for their own pursuit. That makes sense.
It's like when I have to make choices, sometimes I am like, wait, I don't know, because I never like shopping, for example. Is that this good example? If I'm like trying to choose, I'm like, wait a second, I've never actually made a choice to choose what shoes I like or what shirt I like.
Right.
So it's almost like you don't know what you like.
Yes, that's it. You don't know what you like, and so what do? You try this shirt and that shirt and this shirt and that shirt. You try these shoes and those shoes. And in then having the experience of each of those being present for the experience of each of those, gathering the information about them. And then, since it's usually not the whole thing, but pieces of the things, you begin to gather the pieces of what works for you and what doesn't work for you. And then when you look for the next shirt, of course, you're looking for the shirt that has the pieces that work and are leaving out the pieces that don't work. And then that begins to narrow in on what your style is. That selection of what works and what doesn't work. And in the next iteration, choosing the things that work and leaving out. And so there's this organic process where it refines itself just in that process. That makes sense. Christian.
I always think of like archetypal examples of like famous artists, painters, novelists that have spouses that kind of like manage their careers and like feed them and clothe them, and like they would be wandering off into traffic if not for someone that's kind of doing all that work, but they get to be kind of the famous one. That's kind of the trade.
Right. They get to be proximate to the famous person.
Right, all these singers are like not writing their own songs, right? In that case, like the songwriter.
Well, the one of the things about the consolidation of media and the consolidation of culture is that the individual voice, the analog, let's say, is being lost. Market research with supercomputers, right? You're crushing 1 billion pieces of data to come up with what works. And then everything gets homogenized. And so rather than have this heterogenic culture where all of these different things are happening, for instance, when I was coming up, the sound in Manchester was completely different than the sound in London, for instance, because there was enough distance that the scene where the different sounds were developed were far enough apart that there wasn't so much exchange. The scene in Seattle, for instance, so different than Chicago or New York. In Kings Road in the 70s, you'd go down and one shop after another would have these unique items that were made in small operations all over England. And I went, I think in the 2000s, because I wanted to buy some English shoes and there weren't any. They were all the big factory shoes, generic. And so one of the things about this, our culture, as it becomes this monolith, there's very little avenue for anything that isn't that. Part of the idea of, can you, I like to say, can you tell one set of actor abs from another if you just see the abs? Not making sense. What happened to all of that? And then, of course, you see the reaction to it is the digital over processing of everything. People are now shooting film again because it's, at least you can tell that it's not AI generated. Soon we're going to be sitting around campfires and people are going to be playing guitars again in reaction to that sort of that unitive cultural experience that is
Mm.
not meaningful enough, right? That's the thing.
So, I'm sorry, one last thing is the preoccupied exploration. You worked with a lot of students over the years. Is this simply them trying out different things, but the skills that they already gained in their life? Because I feel a lot of the preoccupied will not have any skills.
Well, there's a few shifts that are important. The first shift to make headway, I think, for preoccupied people is to come out of pretend. That is really hard to do. And depending on how far down the rabbit hole of pretend mode is where you read somebody else and decide who you have to be in order to entice that person to engage you. To come out of that pretend mode into an authentic expression. It's not so simple to do because the authentic expression has a lot of painful associations with it because it's so unwanted in childhood. It's a terribly painful process to abandon the authentic experience of self and move into pretend mode. But because the experience of life has presented you only being able to succeed in getting the care you want in pretend mode and never being able to get it from an authentic expression, it's very frightening to attempt to do that. And so, depending on how poor the foundation is for some kind of capacity for emotional regulation, it's very challenging to come out of pretend. Once you come out of pretend mode, what you discover, of course, is that you have this false self, which is very accomplished, and you have an authentic self that is, you know, a bumbling mess. And it feels actually so much safer to be in the false self than in this unskilled, untrained, young, authentic self. And sometimes you can unload the skill set from the false self to the authentic self, but a lot of the times you have to really begin to develop that experience. Once, of course, you've done it, it's totally worth doing and a complete no-brainer, but at the beginning of it, it looks so difficult. And the false self activity is so reliable. The pretend mode is so, or appearing so reliable. You hardly notice the constant sense of deprivation from never actually getting what you want. And half the time you don't even know what that is. So that's all the early process of coming out of it. But then you do. What's a good example? Did you learn to ride a bike when you were a kid? And did you try to learn to ride a bike when you were an adult, not knowing how to ride a bike because you didn't learn how to ride it as a kid? When you fell over as a kid, basically you bounce. When you fall over as an adult, you don't bounce so much. Things like that. Doable. It's doable and it's worth doing. And then how do you get people to support you to do that? So I think one of the reasons why the attachment community is nice to be involved in is because lots of people are trying to do that. And so you have a natural support that's available to you. Disorganized people, the main difficulty for them is the epistemic trust. So epistemic trust means that you believe somebody is telling you the truth. They have evidence for it. and you believe that the reason that they're telling you what they're telling you is meant to be helpful to you. And because disorganized people are so often exploited through that system, it's very hard for them to drop the vigilance that would keep the attachment system active and the exploration system off when attempting to move into supportive, intimate relationships. They're waiting for the betrayal because that's what they were used to in their early experience. So the process now is to develop a sense of the willingness to trust people and developing the mentalizing capacity to see that they do the things that they say they're going to do and they don't do the things that they say they're not going to do, which is one of the capacities of empathy, but also of mentalizing. Is that making sense? It did.
So why can a disorganized person sort of isolate a little bit? I know they'd love to, but isolate so that they can do the exploration at least. Other things, sure, they have to work on in terms of trust, but can they do the exploration in isolation?
The danger always is, is it a pseudo exploration that's really auto-regulating and not actually an exploration that is engaging of the world? And the main way that I like to track that is, are you going out and finding stuff out, and then are you attempting to express it to people that are close to you in an authentic way so that they can really see and understand what it is that's meaningful to you? And often what you find in disorganized people is that there's an absence of the expression of it. And then that just becomes a kind of auto-regulating activity that doesn't really produce much in the way of exploration.
So you said exploration for the world?
The process of exploration is to go out into the world and discover the things that you need to know, and then come back and express them in your social group. What often happens to disorganized people, because they socially isolate to regulate, they don't actually trust anybody to share the most intimate stuff. They engage in activities that would appear to be exploratory, but they're really meant to consume time, and they don't lead to any meaningful discoveries.
So exploration always needs to have a rebounding effect with a group. It cannot just be an exploration that you like to do by yourself.
I don't think so.
Mm-hmm.
We don't really know who we are when we simply withdraw into our internal structures. We really know who we are through the reflection of other people's experience of us. And it's very hard to navigate meaningful exploration if you don't have the reflection of someone else that helps guide you toward the thing that you need to know. You simply get caught up in these internal loops. It's very easy to convince yourself that auto-regulating is stunning exploration. But if it's not communicative, it isn't relatable, then it really simply is this activity of auto-regulating.
So I have a friend, she loves to paint, but she doesn't publish anything to anybody or share with
Nobody
anybody.
ever sees any of them.
No. So it's auto-regulation in that case.
That's what I would,
Really,
yeah.
really good paintings as well. So that's why I'm surprised.
How do you know that your capacity to communicate your discovery is possible if you never attempt to communicate? And in the process of communicating it, illuminate for yourself actually its relevance to you. It's a whole different, a whole level of insight and understanding. How do you know that you've even understood it if it's not expressible?
If it's not expressible.
If you understand something to be one way and then you express it to someone else, and in the process of expressing and their reaction, you have insight into whether that understanding is actually accurate. How do you know otherwise?
Oh, if the other person doesn't.
Oh, what they reflect back to you is another angle to look at what
Oh,
it is that's happening. How easy it is to get lost in your own constructions. How easy it is to misinterpret or misunderstand. Pretty damn easy. Christian.
George, what you're saying follows with exploration, but I'm curious. I mean, I know there's a sangha and it's totally solitary activity, but meditation itself is pretty internal. Like so much of it that's happening can be very interesting, but it's happening very internally. So unless you're having like battles where you're like throwing attainments at people or something, like how much of that can you really communicate to others? So I'm kind of curious about your thoughts on how meditation fits in that framework.
Well, I think that at a certain point, if you're going to make a lot of progress and you're going to know what to do in terms of your practice, it's good to have a teacher that you can express what the experience of your practice is so that they can reflect it back to you. I think that's a very good example. How do you know which insights are worth pursuing and which ones are not? And if you don't have a teacher, what ends up happening for most people is you end up pursuing insights that aren't valuable in terms of the pursuit of liberation. And so you go in these side directions that just consume the energy of practice. Whereas if you have a teacher and they can help guide you through that maze of stuff that comes up, you have a more direct path to liberation than you might. At a certain point beyond the beginning, if you want to go into the intermediate or advanced practices, you need to find a teacher who you can relate to, or you can't find your way. Say that's it. And then also, if we use the ideal parent figure protocol as an example, you are encouraged to go into the protocol and simply express what's coming up for you, and you have the facilitator who's interpreting the way that you create the experiences of reality from an attachment lens. And if you create a version of reality that isn't in what would be considered a secure path, you're redirected toward the secure path. So that process is the same process that I'm talking about in the other aspect of it. That makes sense. We've talked for a long time and didn't leave much time for meditation, so we just do 20 minutes or so of loving kindness practice. All right, let go of the meditation. How's that? So tomorrow, actually, we have a class, level 2 class starting on Friday mornings, 10:30 to 12:30. If you haven't done a level 2 or that's interesting to you, consider it. We have a half day long on exploration at the end of the month. And then we have one in October. So there's 2 of them. One is the basic concept of exploration. And then I thought that I would talk about exploration through the lens of making the photographs that I make so that it's more hands-on and that way. What else? I think that's about it. That's coming up right away. Most of that's on the website, so take a look at it. I offer the teaching freely, but I do hope that if you're able to support myself and Mettagroup through a donation, which you can do on the website, that's really appreciated. Any amount helps support me and also the work we do at Mettagroup. Thank you for your practice, and I will see you soon.